Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our event. I am Tambra Jackson, the Interim Dean for the School of Education at IUPUI, and I'm delighted to have you all present with us this evening. I'm looking forward to the conversation we get to have about partnerships for education equity. The School of Education is committed to examining our collective role in improving the human condition. That is actually a part of our mission statement. And we do this with an explicit focus on social justice, inclusive of anti-racist and anti-oppressive perspectives and actions. And tonight's event is an opportunity for us to connect with each of you, parents, education professionals, alumni, policymakers, and campus and community partners to help inform our work for education equity. During this evening, we will have an opportunity to hear from our phenomenal featured speaker and then dialogue in small groups. So first, I'd like to draw your attention to a few housekeeping items before we get started. First, this is an interactive event, so we are asking you to please keep yourself muted during the opening presentation. And Laverne is our master event coordinator, and she will send you a little private message if you forget. After Dr. Vasquez Heilig's opening presentation, we want an opportunity to hear from you. So we will be going into breakout rooms with designated faculty and staff facilitators, and you will get some notifications on the screen that will let you know that you will be directed into a breakout room. When that time is wrapping up in the breakout rooms, Laverne will cue us that we have 5 minutes left, that we have 1 minute left. You don't need to do anything. Just you will automatically go back into the main room. There's going to be a blue button that pops up and asks you if you want to do that ahead of time. We're asking that you not push that. Just let the technology do the work for us. When we return to the main room for an opportunity to have Dr. Vasquez Heilig respond to questions and further elaborate on ideas from the breakout rooms, then I'm going to ask you to please remember to mute your microphones again. We encourage questions and thoughts and sharing and ideas to circulate in the chat. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker for this evening. So Dr. Julian Vasquez Heilig is the Dean and a Professor of Educational Policy Studies and Evaluation at the University of Kentucky College of Education. He has held 5 academic leadership roles in higher education institutions and a variety of practitioner and research positions in organizations from Boston to Beijing. He is a committed academic leader that seeks to improve access and success for historically underrepresented students. He has led in a community-engaged, innovative, equity-minded, and transformative approach. Over the course of his academic and professional careers, he has proven and distinguished himself as an individual who has a strong command of research skills and courage for justice. He is an academic leader and researcher with a conscience and a heart. Dr. Vasquez Heilig's multimodal, interdisciplinary education policy and leadership research is primarily focused on education policy and leadership that impacts equity and inclusion. The sum of his scholarship is more than 60 articles, chapters, and reports. He has received more than 30 scholarly awards and recognitions, including California Assembly Resolution 1459, which honored his national impact in the field of education. Dean Vasquez Heilig's work has been cited by the New York Times, Washington Post, Associated Press, USA Today, Education Week, Huffington Post, and other print and electronic media outlets. He has also appeared to discuss his research on local and national radio and TV, including PBS, NBC, NPR, Univision, and MSNBC. Notably, Harvard's Education Next magazine named him as one of the top 10 education policy voices, the #2 ranked professor in the US. He has conveyed invited testimony in state and national legislative bodies. He has also volunteered expertise and provided empirically based input for nonprofits, foundations, legislators, educators, and other education stakeholders in Kentucky, California, Texas, Nevada, Wyoming, and many other states. He also served as a volunteer education policy advisor and provided input for presidential and gubernatorial campaigns. Dr. Vasquez Heilig obtained his PhD in Education Administration and Policy Analysis and a master's in sociology from Stanford University. He also holds a master's of higher education and a bachelor's of history and psychology from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. I'm not going to hold that against him because I am a Michigan State Spartan alum, so I'll let that pass. But without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Dean Vasquez Heilig.
Well, thank you so much. Can you hear me? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay, great. You know how it is, you start talking and you talk for 5 minutes and you forgot to take mute off. So really glad to join you all. The things that, the common denominator that I think that all of us have on this call and in this conversation today is that we wake up in the morning thinking about how we can impact the lives of children and their families. So you read that bio and it makes me tired just hearing it, but that's what always is the center of what I do. And I know I share that with each of you. So also I want to thank you. I put on a suit today. I even put on cologne, in this COVID era. I know you can't smell my cologne, but I did put it on. And so I'm just honored to join you and have this conversation. Dr. Shurik and others in your community have reached out to me over the past year and talked about some of the things that are occurring there in Indianapolis. And I think part of the challenge of this is that this is a playbook. It's a playbook that you see in other cities. There are threads that wind through that playbook. There are organizations and ideologies that wind through that playbook. And so we're going to talk about some of that today. This talk's going to have 3 parts. First, we're going to talk about the inequity. Then we're going to talk about how a group of folks, education reformers, neoliberals, market-based folks, how they talk about this problem. And then I want to talk about how we should be talking about this problem with community-based, community-engaged work that involves partnerships between coalitions and stakeholders. So that's just a quick layout. They only gave me 2 hours to talk, so I'll try to get, 20 minutes? 20 minutes? Oh, okay. They only gave me 20 minutes to talk, so we'll have to go through it fairly quickly, but there'll be plenty of opportunities, I think, for clarification and vigorous discussion, depending on who is on this call today. Okay, let me see if I can get this technology working right here. Let's see, play. All right, it's working. So I think, where I start most conversations that I have with different stakeholder groups, I've given presentations in more than 100 different places over the years. And I think one of the places I like to start in the conversation is that elephant in the room. Here you see a Banksy art exhibit, but that elephant in the room in education is inequality. And that inequality is baked in. It's baked in because everyone knows that the nicer home you buy, the better public school you get, which says that we know the inequality that's occurring, and we know that certain students are privileged over others on purpose. It's not by mistake, it's baked in. So what does this mean in Indiana? So writ large, a majority of public schools in 17 states were served low-income students, those eligible for free and reduced lunch. And that's from the National Opportunity to Learn Coalition, which is affiliated with the Schott Foundation, which I'm honored to serve on their board. And these are conversations about opportunity rather than about gaps. And so we also know in Indiana, almost 47%, and the numbers fluctuate somewhat, but based on this report by the Opportunity to Learn Coalition, about half, about 47% of students are free and reduced lunch in Indiana. And you see in the city of Indianapolis, it's 70% or more, again, depending on which year you're talking about. And so it's very clear. It's very clear that there is excessive inequality, not only in your state, but many states and localities across the United States. So if you look at the work that Bruce Baker has done, he puts out, he's an economist at Rutgers, and he's often doing work, he's an economist, he's often doing work about fairness and funding of districts. And so they give a grade to each state in terms of how they're funding their schools. And so you see Indiana with an F in per capita gross state product. And you can see what that means. The effort index takes into account state spending in relation to economic productivity and gross state product. So in a state that has fairly positive economic indicators over time, you see the relative investment to those economic indicators a failing grade. Then how about school funding fairness, which is wages for teachers and teacher to student ratios, et cetera, et cetera. Again, Indiana, an F. What does this mean? What does it mean when society has baked in inequality in your city, in your state, and nationally? We know that states with low funding levels tend to have lower teacher wages. Indiana typically ranks in the bottom quintile nationally, in the bottom 10 states. Of course, it changes a little bit year to year. But the bottom line is that Indiana is one of the states, bottom performing states in terms of compensating its teachers. And of course, we know that less competitive teacher wages leads to higher turnover and other things. And we also know that these indicators, as Dr. Baker has identified, are patterns across indicators, meaning that unfair student funding leads to a direct deprivation of resources critical for success in school. Oops. Okay. Now the challenge is where we started, is that this is baked into the system, that there are certain students, certain families that have beautiful football fields, they have performing arts centers, they have extracurriculars, they have AP courses, and this is all on purpose. This is all on purpose. And so, but we don't talk about that privilege. We don't talk about the fact that in every city on the other side of the tracks, the highway, etc., that there is high quality public education. And what we need to be able to do is offer those things and make the same investments that the wealthy are making in their students. Now, the response to this inequality and the outcry that has come from historically marginalized communities is that, and this is actually across the spectrum when it comes to public policy. So Noam Chomsky, and it's a really good film, so this is the first homework I want to give you. It's called Requiem for the American Dream. And he talks about the historical context and sort of the evolution of public policy to be less about inequality. So you think about Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society, et cetera, FDR, the progressive era. But public policy has been moving towards how do we create policies that enact less democracy in public policy instead of focusing on less inequality. So I think the grandfather of these ideas, of this sort of top-down, market-based education reform, what I mean by top-down is that communities have less say in what happens in their schools and their curriculum, the way students are assessed, etc. That market-based grandfather would probably be Milton Friedman, won the Nobel Prize, but his bottom line was that they believed that the public education system, he believed, should be abolished. Now, what you hear is sort of some political framing around this, which is that, well, it's okay, all schools are okay. Private schools are great, charter schools are great, Public schools are great, but inevitably, as those schools grow in size, charters, of course, we know have doubled over the last decade. As those schools grow in size, it reduces the economics of efficiency for communities in operating their public schools. So now we're operating in some states where you have explicit vouchers. The public is now funding 3 systems of education. In states where they don't have vouchers, like California, they're funding 2 systems of education. Here in Kentucky, we only fund 1 system of education, and that is public schools. And so in a time of scarce resources, what you have is this drawdown that's on purpose. The ultimate goal of market-based approaches was to make sure that education was privately managed and or privatized. Of course, charters are privately managed by for-profit and non-profit corporations. Privatization would be, of course, schools that are for-profit public schools, non-profit, private schools, and for-profit private schools. So I want to give you some more homework. I only have 20 minutes, so I can't talk extensively about all the different things that are happening in Indiana. What I heard the rocket ship, or Carp DM, CEO once said at AEI. I don't have time to talk about all those things. But I think, one, does choice address economic inequality? Something for you to think about. Who has the moral high ground? What do the nation's largest and newest civil rights movements say about market-based school choice? That would be NAACP and the Black Lives Matter movement. They've weighed in on this. Do families actually choose in a market? And I'll give you one quick example. I can choose Harvard, but does that mean I can go to Harvard? Who is supporting market-based education reform by the scenes? Who is funding this? And what is the cabal of actors that are involved? Some of those are Teach for America, the Walton Foundation, the Broad Foundation, the Arnold Foundation, the Gates Foundation. And there's a lot of work on this, and I can share that with you afterwards if you'd like to see that. But there's network analysis that show the connections between TNTP and TFA and all those organizations and how they're connected. Jameson Brewer has done some of that work in peer-reviewed fashion. Do voucher and charter students actually perform better than public schools? Who conducts that research? Is it peer-reviewed? And what does the predominance of peer-reviewed literature actually say about charter schools and vouchers? And what transparency and accountability is needed? This is essentially the deregulation of public dollars and sent to privately managed and privatized schools. And what do we know about financial irregularities and malfeasance in the face of this deregulation of dollars that are no longer directly publicly accountable to citizens and others? So to answer these questions and more, I recommend you go to my blog, Cloaking Inequity. It's a labor of love. I've been doing this blog since 2012, 1 million readers in more than 200 countries. So you can find answers to all these questions on my blog, and there's a lot of peer-reviewed research concise there. So now let's get to the third part. You know, every good play has 3 acts, right? And I have to do each and all 3 in 20 minutes. So what instead? Mobilizing local education reform. So we know that the dominant paradigm of this top-down private control of school takeovers, charter schools, vouchers, that these paradigms persist despite vocal opposition from many quarters. And one of the big critiques that you hear from parents and that you hear from communities and you hear from educators is that these top-down hierarchical models essentially ostracize community-based alternatives to those approaches. And I'll narrow that down for you in a moment. What I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you, here's the top-down privatization approaches that you see in education reform on the left. On the right, here's the alternative solution that's community-engaged, community-based, and present opportunities for us to collaborate in new coalitions. there's more research coming to the forefront about how effective the community-based models are. Those include community schools and peer assistance and review. There's lots of research showing the positive impacts of these approaches that exceed what you see with, say, charter schools or TFA. And over the last 20 years, you see a greater, and you see this summer, that sort of powerful surge focused on equity and justice. And I think it's incumbent upon us to, as a part of the solutions that our leaders and that our communities are seeking, that those solutions should also include opportunities in education. And I'm doing a lot of work on that behind the scenes too. So I think that the future, the opportunities for us in these sort of collaborative efforts are how do we front and center the community voice and coalitions over all these external actors in education reform. So the billionaire foundations, the large scale education reform organizations, and we can make a list of those. And if you're Teach for America, I just want to say, this is not about you. This is not about your legacy. This is about the role of the organization in privatization and private control of democratically governed schools. So, sometimes I have TFA folks and they get a little upset that I talk about their relationship as this larger cabal, because TFA works very hard to put their alums in influential positions in education. But I think these things, I'm okay with being the skunk in the garden party. I'm okay with that. Just ask NCTQ. I gave him a piece of my mind today, actually. All right, so we were talking about what top-down private control and privatization education reform looks like, and what those alternatives look like on the right. So on the left, you have all these conversations about value-added evaluation. You have Teach for America. You have privately managed charters. You have school district takeover, closure portfolios. I mean, they come up with different names for it year to year. Privatized high-stakes assessment, top-down NCLB style accountability. On the right, we have the community-based approaches to these education reforms where we can collaborate as a community, where we can be engaged and we're relevant. And communities are seen as a solution rather than the problem when we're engaging in these reforms. And I understand that there's challenges with some of these. I'm aware of the critiques. For example, peer assistance and review in LA has been used inappropriately in the past. But essentially what that does is it uses consultant expert teachers to assess teacher quality and provide interventions for teachers. And that's a community-driven approach to that, instead of having a quantoid like me sitting in an office calculating a value-added model. University district partnerships. It's very important that we as institutions of higher education are working directly with districts on our principalship programs, on our teacher programs, because you have these fly-by-night, loosely and concretely affiliated organizations like the Relay Graduate School that is run by TFA, acolytes, and others. And their goal is to insert standardized, often debunked approaches to education and training future principals, teachers, et cetera, in those modes and methods. And so it's incumbent upon us that we make it very clear that the kinds of experiences that our principals, our superintendents, our teachers will have in universities, and make sure that districts understand the benefit of having leaders and educators that can hit the ground running. In district charters, I get folks to say to me, well, I want to start a charter school. I'm an incredible educator. I want to do it for the Hawaiian community or the Black community or et cetera. And the first question I ask them is, why does that charter have to be privately managed? Why can't you look for an innovative district that's interested, where you are still democratically accountable to the families in that locale or in that city? Of course, there's big conversations now about community schools and districts. I know that one of the campaigns is talking about community schools, and they have in the Unity platform. And again, I'm not going to be political today, but I think you can probably guess which campaign that is. And you could see this as sort of retro, going back to the progressive era that David Tyack and even Diane Ravitch wrote about many years ago. But how do you do wraparound work with students so that you address the challenges that that poverty presents for students. Formative and summative local assessment. What people don't talk about is NCOB essentially privatized assessment and handed over billions of dollars to Pearson and other companies and took assessment from teachers and schools. And then finally, my baby, essentially, I should say, back in 2012, I went to an accountability conference in Rome, and I thought that we needed an approach to accountability that was local, that was strategic, that was multiple measured, and that was driven at the community level. And I called it community-based accountability. In Texas, they still call it community-based accountability, and you have many districts now implementing that. In California, they call it local accountability, specifically LCAPs, local accountability plans. And so now you have this idea of how we do accountability in a bottom-up fashion being implemented in the bluest of blue states and in the reddest of red states, although some people say Texas might be purple now, but a red state and a blue state are both implementing community-based approaches because Republicans like that work because it's about local control and locally driven. Democrats like that work because it's about empowerment. And so this is a set of policies. On the left, you have what education reform has been pushing for. And if you get in their way, then somehow you're not about equity and you're the status quo and you're the best friend of unions. I mean, you've heard all of the tropes, right? But on the right are the alternatives. Here's what we can do together. Here's what's community-based and democratically controlled. And we'll talk about how we form those interactions. So school, university, community partnerships, a couple of things. One of the difficulties here is that my picture is covering part of these slides. Okay, I'll make do. So first, not only in higher education, but we've got to hold ourselves accountable for the leaders that we choose. So we hire a superintendent, and I'm not talking about the superintendent in Indianapolis or anywhere else right now. I'm just talking in general. So we hire a superintendent, and he or she comes in and does exactly what they say they're going to do, and then we're disappointed. They turn over schools to charter schools, or they hire massive amounts of alternately certified teachers that are not qualified to teach on day one. All of these sorts of things. So when you hire a broad superintendent, that's what you're going to get every single time. And so it's kind of like dating. If you're using certain criteria to choose your partner and it's always not working out, why would you keep using those criteria? And so we've got to choose leaders who are innovative, who are community engaged, community relevant, and transformative. And it's not just superintendents. We need to choose school board members with those criteria. We need to choose deans and chairs with those criteria. We need to choose politicians, because that way we change the paradigm, because those are the things that are most important to us. So we've got to get our priorities right when we're making decisions about leaders. Then we'll find ourselves being less disappointed down the road. And we've got to commit to democracy. And this is a tough one. In this era, I mean, we can't even get the post office to deliver ballots. You have all sorts of controversy related to democracy. But we've got to stay focused on being community-based and community engaged in our education reform efforts and our leadership efforts. There's that old saying, I don't know if any of you have been on the streets marching. I have. The people united will never be defeated. And I think that is the key here, is that when you create coalitions, you can make change. No matter how much money the other side has, because I'm gonna tell you, I always know who my friends are, because my friends are always the ones that are broke. The folks that have the matching t-shirts and the matching cameras and the matching Subway lunches, you know who I'm talking about. That money's coming from somewhere. So my side are like, okay, let's all pitch in for Taco Bell. So we also need to strategically guide consensus in our institutions of higher education, where we need to hold our mayors accountable, our superintendents accountable, principals accountable, because we need to make investments in low-income communities and people of color. Because not only is there inter-district inequality, so you know that how across the street, across the highway, but there's also intra-district inequality. Even within your own district, there are certain schools that are privileged over others, and we have to hold ourselves accountable to that. So I also am a big believer in mobilizing in social, new, and traditional media. Now, some of you may have seen the recent film on Netflix called The Social Discourse or something. It's in the top 10 list right now. And essentially what that documentary talks about is that the social media companies are trying to manipulate you to buy things. Now, I understand that. I understand, but you can also use social media to make change. You just have to go into it knowing that Facebook wants you to buy stuff. I'm gonna tell you, I tried the chicken nuggets that Instagram advertised to me last week. They're not worth it. So yes, I fall victim to that too, right? But the bottom line is that social media allows us to cross borders that we never would have been able to cross before. I can post a video, like a 30-second clip, and I can get 10,000 views in 30 days, 20 days, 10,000 people. And that's the sort of impact that you can have. If it's a really interesting clip, you can get that in a week. So you've got to think about, how do I use social media to my advantage? How are the different social media platforms different? Because LinkedIn is different from Twitter, is different from Facebook. And I have an entire talk about how to do public scholarship in social media. And the same applies if you're an activist or an advocate, how to do that work in social media too. And I think we've got to think about, how do we recreate the historic civil rights era by enhancing relationships and building coalitions, strategic partnerships. And those stakeholder groups are the community and civil rights organizations and academics and the faith community and the teachers associations and other stakeholders. Because there is a plethora of what are called astroturf organizations. I was talking with Linda Darling Hammond about some of this the other day, and she's like, well, how do you know who the community is? And the way you know who the community is you demand coalitions of groups. Because what Walton Foundation, and I spoke at the Urban League maybe 3 years ago when it was in Baltimore, and I came off the stage and the CEO of the Walton Family Foundation said to me, Julian, we agree on more than we disagree on. And then he said to me, we agree on more than we disagree on. I said, okay. And so what you see Walton Foundation doing after that point is spending money on these sort of astroturf parent organizations in San Francisco and Houston and other places. What we mean by astroturf is fake grassroots. And when you go into their 990s, you see where their money is coming from. It's coming from these billionaire philanthropic foundations that have prioritized these privatization and private management approaches to education reform. So you got to be careful with that. And quite frankly, there are people in these different groups that have been bought off by this cabal. They will take money to write for websites. They will take money to support particular positions. Again, we have to be cautious about that. But again, I truly believe the people united will never be defeated. So one last thought. I don't know how I'm doing on time, but education empowers us as seekers and speakers of truth. We must retain democratic controls of our schools now more than ever, in an era of alternative facts and fake news and gaslighting and propaganda. We must protect this, the intellectual compass of our democracy. Thank you.